we're going to talk about DeepSeek. I'm guessing most people have heard about this. This was a bit of a mic drop moment, not by coincidence either. I mean, please try to convince me that the $500 billion announcement of Stargate, closely followed by publicity around DeepSeek, which had actually already been available, just hadn't gotten a lot of attention in press, was a coincidence. It absolutely was not. And at first glance, at first it's like, well, what's not to like? 30 claims of being 30 times cheaper to actually run, open source, so people can really get down in the guts and they can even edit it to meet their needs. And I could go on. Sounded great. We know as each day has gone by, there's way more to the story, and there's a lot of nuance around these claims, if not just outright, some of them being declared false. Now, Rob, I'm going to start with you, because let's just jump into the security and political and national security implications of this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on both, how this is just really part of a traditional playbook, regardless of what the tools are, but then your specific thoughts around DeepSeek. Sure.
Well, thank you. This is not dissimilar from other espionage operations that China has run. The MSS, their security service, is particularly good at a number of operations. Tech operations is one of their fortes. This has been on their. To put this in context, there's an argument about DeepSeek that it cost $6 million to create this model, and that they compare that $6 million to what OpenAI has spent. The reality, though, is that the infrastructure to create that model, yes, it was borrowed from OpenAI, which doesn't make me sad, because OpenAI borrowed content from everybody on the planet.
Everyone else too.
So we're stealing from thieves. Okay, It does trouble me, though, that they've hidden the fact that they are using existing infrastructure from ByteDance and their platforms, and they're co-located in Malaysia with energy, actually with production facilities for energy, YTL, thank you, YTL, and that there is a giant investment. I was getting things on my Signal app, pictures from server farms in Shenzhen, with H100 servers. And so it's not as if the tech isn't there. Our sanctions and our prohibitions and our regulation around the tech is not working. It's too easy to get your hands on it through a third party these days. And so that's behind the story is that number is probably multitudes of that. I mean, it's 6 million is not real. What they have done, though, is through the 1,000 Talents program, China's been able to attract a ton of talent. And they've gone on the offensive when it's talent time. They've come to the States with the Confucius Institutes, which are now mostly gone. But there was a very strong effort to recruit nationally for Chinese companies to move their families. I know a number of professors who left professorial gigs for $1 million contracts in China. It would be hard to say no. So that's sort of right out of their playbook, is let's go get the talent, let's use the diaspora to collect, let's advance on tech, so rather than building landlines, we'll just jump into cell phones, so that metaphor of let's just leapfrog existing. We'll steal from OpenAI, because who cares? And here we are.
And then steal from anybody who puts their data into the engine.
Yes.
Yes. And that's the risk, there are ways to get this onto your machine so it's not talking to the world. Don't count on them. So my recommendation is stay away. It is, unless you want all of your personal data and or corporate data to leak out into the universe.
And we're actually, I do want to mention the so-called deep leak find that a cybersecurity company found recently. Before we get to that, Ryan, you had an interesting initial reaction to DeepSeek. And I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit on that to the audience, because you were not surprised at all.
No, I think that this follows a pattern. It follows not only a pattern as Rob described in terms of some of the PSYOPs and things like that, but it follows some of the more sort of technology evolution patterns that we can pay attention to. Gosh, excuse me. Number one is that the economics of compute always decrease, right? And so compute gets faster, easier, cheaper to access. Therefore, there's more and more of it that's out there. Therefore, there's more and more innovation that comes through. Again, mirror that with the unique nature of generative AI and the fact that we have very rapidly emerging and deployed AI tools should not be a surprise to anybody. That's exactly what we would expect. And there's always a democratization of these technology capabilities. I mean, think about, what was it, 10 years ago, there was a huge worry. Actually, this was the genesis of OpenAI, right? There was a worry that one or two companies were going to control all of AI in the world, and then there was a sort of a reaction to that engendered this organization. It's exactly the opposite of what typically happens, because cost goes down, everybody can afford to play, everybody plays, and then there's more and more innovation and more access. So this was predictable as contextually. The fact that it sort of seems to have emerged from nowhere, that might be a little bit of a surprise, but from a model and a pattern perspective, it's absolutely expected that these kinds of things happen. The long tail of this that is interesting is if you take away the Chinese element of this, if you take away some of the fabrication of the economics behind it, the fact that open source is getting more and more attention is actually an interesting point. Again, entirely predictable, because this is what happens with these technology cycles, and it's just a further acceleration of the capability. But whether it's open source from company X or open source from company Y, that's been an ongoing topic for a number of years now. Incidentally, there are inherent risks within open source models that you have to be paying very careful attention to in terms of backdoors and all the other kinds of things that you would expect from cyber. But all of this fits into a pattern. The thing that AI is really changing is the speed of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very, very well said. I want to touch on the security and the supposed cost savings. Security first. A couple of days ago, a company called Wiz, that is a cybersecurity company, came out with the statement, and seemed to be enough proof that this is real, that they had been able to find and easily get into a database online that had records of almost all of the chats that users had had so far with DeepSeek. Slightly concerning, seems to be real. I'll let you find your surprised face. Any thoughts on, how quickly that was done and honestly how decisively?
In retrospect, the day that you heard of DeepSeek, you probably should have done two things. Number one was buy the dip, right? And yes. Number two was send an email to everybody that you know saying, if it's not obvious to you, don't use this thing with anything personal or private or secure. Italy, of all places, immediately locked this thing down and said this is a risk to our population. We don't trust it, etc. I'm not sure if anybody else did, but I thought that was a very aggressive.
Ireland as well.
So a couple of countries sort of looked at this in a very specific way. But again, none of this is a surprise to me. Before we adopt any of these kinds of emergent capabilities, we do need to go through the right kind of security, the right kind of cyber review, all of the things that we're used to doing. And it might mean that we're not looking at something like a DeepSeek model in hour one. I don't see why that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Rob, I think, Ryan lists some of the due diligence, the basics that we want to do before using any tool. Would you apply those to any tool regardless of whether it comes from China or not?
Yes, I would. And my biggest concern with these models, with large language models and the generative AI, is that it will use all extant data to train. Mm-hmm. So anything that exists is training data if it can get its hands on it. Because these different models are more or less difficult to manipulate or jailbreak or trap or poison or any number of other metaphors, they have varying flavors of their own sort of internal security, but it's particularly easy to jailbreak or poison DeepSeek versus other tech. But these should all be built into the test cycle for any technology. That it's certainly within the CIA and NSA, the hoops that you have to go through are significant, because once it's in, it's in. And it's really difficult to get it back out. It will get access to everything, ideally. I mean, if you really want the AI to perform at its highest level, you're going to have to give it access to a lot of data. And then that puts you at risk.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into the topic of data for us. Real quick before we get there, I've been hearing from a lot of folks I know still in operational roles that they've been specifically experimenting with sandboxed versions of DeepSeek to validate these claims of cost savings. And that story is a lot more nuanced than you would think. You know, regardless of how much did they spend to train it, one of the selling points is that consumers will spend less on compute to use it. But that sounds like it might not be such a simple story.
Oh, for each inference that the machine is making, it's costing compute. Mm-hmm. And so you can't really bypass that. There isn't a version of this that's lean enough in terms of code that you'll be able to bypass that cost. It just is. So the cost to compute, if anything, with each inference and each transformer function, the costs are going to be attached.
Yeah.
The savings isn't there.
I would probably say our best hope there on savings is simply this, version of Moore's Law that Ryan highlighted a while ago. We're seeing almost, weekly innovations in the chips from the companies, from the NVIDIAs, from the you name thems, that are leading to massive cost savings, because it's in their best interest, of course. So my guess is I think that's where we're going to have to pin our hopes, really, for most cost savings.
Well, I think it's going to be a combination of things. I mean, we don't need 50 companies spending $500 billion on building the next LLM. That just doesn't make sense. As I mentioned earlier, we know that it's always the case that these things become more democratized, more accessible. That doesn't mean that you need to have the full complement of absolutely everything that OpenAI has in order to optimize your SEO marketing or something like that, right? And so we've known for a long time that there were going to be basically portfolios of applications here. Some of them may run on top of the big LLM models. Some of them may be more custom. Some of them may be internal. Some of them may be whatever you like. We have to think about this as a portfolio as opposed to a monolith, right? There will be different size applications, different energy costs, different compute costs. There will be different dynamics that go through this. This is part of why this is complex, and part of why it merits some real strategic attention, because it's absolutely not one size fits all. And again, it's just moving extraordinarily quickly. The things that we were predicting in 2024 largely came to pass. The things that we're looking at in 25 are just further acceleration, but they're actually nothing that we would have talked about in 24.
And the things you just mentioned there, Ryan, about each company's strategy, use, and deployment of AI is going to be a portfolio that suits them. I'd like to throw the same thing out there. What he said is the case for how you use the cloud, how you use, X as a service, whether it's software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platforms as a service. All of these tools are out there now, but it's never just one simple story. Fully go to the cloud and yay, enjoy the cost savings, right? Not so much, right? You need to re-architect things to work the best in the cloud. You need to make sure you're, quote, spinning up and spinning down machines so that you're not wasting compute in the cloud. Taking advantage of all of these technological innovations can lead to great cost savings for your companies, but your senior management teams and their organizations really need to understand the true story there. And I think a great opportunity for collaboration there is, that's a great collab opportunity between tech and finance, right? And that's great, because those groups must be talking together as we determine these rollout plans, strategies, et cetera, going forward. Or your balance sheet is not going to thank you in the least. We're going to move to data. How I'd like to preface this little section on data real quick is, we've been talking about it for a while. I mean, this is not new, but I'm a bit of the belief that a lot of our conversations around data over the last decade have been very much centered around risks, privacy risks of data, consent risks. Are you violating the consent you have or you don't have from your customers? How are you collecting and using your customer data, and. But an element that I believe about data that's now needing to come more to the forefront of conversation and does touch the board level is the importance of data as a currency or as a fuel for AI. We need to now be talking about that. And that's a new opportunity, number one. It's kind of exciting. But, Rob, I'll start with you on this one. How do you see some of the trends? More edge compute, more agentic AI. How does that change and maybe even enhance or redefine what data means to enterprises?
I think one of the things that's most interesting about large language models and generative AI is not just its ability to generate novel products, novel data as a result of its compute. It's also its capacity to touch all of the extant data in an organization. Mm-hmm. That you could collect both the knowledge, the wisdom, the expertise, and experience of everyone in your outfit, and harness that in a way that you've never been able to do that before. So, to me, the data can feed that, and I think that goes hand in glove with the notion of the data is currency. The data is energy. It's also a product of what you produce creatively. And we talked a little bit about this last night. I think that the companies that figure out, and in my mind, the computer has gone from a tool to a team member. And we just haven't caught up to it yet as humans. That our next step is to figure out how to engage this team member. What does a human-computer team actually mean, especially in our use case? So at the NSA, for instance, the use case was we want to take away 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day or 4 hours a day of busy work. So we want our analysts to actually focus on analysis. The core function of their role is to focus on analysis. If they're filling out forms and chasing data, that's not what we want to pay them to do. Let's make our promise to our employees that we're going to make your life better by partnering you with AI rather than replacing you with AI. Principally because there are going to be core functions that you can't replace with AI. Mm-hmm. Those are the kind of use cases where I see the most opportunity now. 5 years out, the data that we collect, the more data we get from instrumentation. In the military, every soldier is a sensor. Right? You're packed with all of this technology, and you're collecting data from the environment all the time. When we embody AI in robots or industrial controls or other environments, mm-hmm. that interaction is going to be part of their training data. Mm-hmm. And they're going to get smarter a lot faster. And I use smarter very loosely. I mean, it's just fast math. I mean, there's a lot of sleight of hand, but it's just fast math. So fast math applied to all this new data is going to change the way that we engage with machines and technology. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.